Since the mid-19th century, when you have the creation in places like Egypt and India and eventually the Ottoman Empire, the creation of kind of alternative systems of education to the madrasa system, there was the production of what one could term sort of Islamic intellectuals who are not trained according to the madrasa system, but are trained, have some familiarity with the classical Islamic tradition of education, but have sort of trained to think along lines of Western universities, and then they, start giving their opinions on Islamic issues. So I think since the 19th century, there's been creation of kind of a second voice in Islamic thoughts, the sort of lay Muslim intellectual. That has its benefits. It creates a challenge to classical Muslim scholars. It makes them think differently. It makes them address issues that they might not otherwise address. But it also has people answering questions or weighing in on issues where they might not necessarily have the proper sufficient background training. Second, and because those people come out of modern Western institutions, they tend to enjoy a lot more prestige, both amongst the elite in Muslim countries, but also perhaps internationally. Of course, then in the really beginning in the 1990s, you have the proliferation of information technology and internet and websites. So these lay intellectuals not only have the traditional means of expressing themselves through print and spoken word, but now they can do so on websites. So I think there's been a proliferation of opinions, in part due to this sort of second voice, as I said before, of the lay intellectual, but also because of technology. And I think that has its benefits. It creates, again, sort of more competition, raises quality of Islamic discourse to a certain extent, but it also creates risks because Muslims don't necessarily know who to listen to, and somebody in some chat room or some online mufti might not be qualified or might be intentionally misleading Muslims, and it's hard for Muslims to know. I don't necessarily think it erodes it in and of itself. It challenges it. And if it demonstrates failings in the classical Islamic scholarly tradition or in the training or approach of Muslim scholars today, it would erode it, but it does not necessarily erode it. Sometimes if, classically trained Muslim scholars, if they learn how to use, internet and express themselves online, they can do a good job of defending themselves and perhaps even eroding the authority of these lay intellectuals. I think a lot of it depends on the makeup of the Muslim community. When you take a place like, let's say, Bosnia, Bosnian Muslims are mostly Bosnian as far as I know. I mean, they pretty much probably all Hanafi school, they have common history. So in that situation, you have a relatively high level of homogeneity in terms of practice, in terms of understanding of law, understanding of culture. And so in that situation, it becomes much easier to have one unified authority because there's probably less internal disagreement. The problem with having one authority is who picks the authority. If you are a Muslim living in the West, or let's say a Bosnian living under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and your authority is picked by the government of Germany or the government of France or the Austro-Hungarian government, then there raises a question of whether or not that authority really has the best interests of Muslims in mind. And so I think alongside this question of how should authority be structured, there's a question of the point that it's very important for Muslims to pick their own leaders, not allow those leaders to be picked by outside forces. In terms of what authority systems work best, whether it should be unified or not, I think if, when you in a place like the United States, let's say, or even to a certain extent Germany, where you have a lot of diversity, relatively, in the United States especially, have a lot of diversity in the Muslim community, ethnic, cultural, economic, geographical. It's hard to have one unified authority for all issues. And I think that's good because people should be able to pray different ways or celebrate marriages in different ways. But I think it is useful to have, for a Muslim community that's living within the boundaries of one nation state. I think it's important for them to be able to have one, maybe a body or a committee, a commission or something of Muslim leaders who can come to agreement on issues that are of importance for both kind of issues of cooperation within the Muslim community and then also with the outside communities as well. So for example, when Eid is celebrated, when Ramadan begins, how maybe should mosques be laid out? How are Muslims going to respond to some terrorist attack? How are they going to deal with government policies? I think in this situation, it's better to have not necessarily one unified authority, but at least a committee of people who can work together to express the Muslim community's voice with its internal diversity in a manageable way to the outside world. Well, first of all, there's lots of different types of mujtahids. I mean, this is going back to, Ibn Rushd discusses this, Ibn Nawawi discusses this, Ibn al-Salah discusses this in the 13th century. So there's lots of different, generally, 5 levels of mujtahids. There's not necessarily sticking to these 5, but just let's go through maybe a more brief type. There's what's called mujtahid mustaqil, or completely independent mujtahid, which means that you just derive law and theology directly from the original scriptures of Islam. And Muslim scholars disagree if this is possible after really the 900s and 1000s of the Common Era, because not because there's something existential about that period, but just because there's only so many ways you can derive law from the Quran and the Sunnah. I mean, there's only many ways to think about how to pray, and maybe once these different interpretive methods have been developed and exhausted, it's hard to come and introduce a new method. Another one is mujtahid mutlaq, which means absolute mujtahid, which is sometimes confused with the first type, which means that you can derive law and scripture, derive law and theology on your own, but you acknowledge that you're not really able to come up with new answers. You're basically maybe coming up with slightly different answers, but within maybe one school of law or theology. Then there's mujtahids within a school of law who decide, let's say, that school of law's position on a new question, or pick between existing positions in that school of law. Then you have scholars who are just mujtahids in the sense that they get asked to give fatwas, and usually they should just stick with the main position of their school of law. So there's lots of different levels of mujtahid. I think when people say, how do you become a mujtahid, what they really mean is, how do you become someone who can independently go back to the sources of Islam as a religion, come up with your own answer for what we should do or what we should think? In that case, really talking about kind of mujtahid mutlaq or mujtahid mustaqil, independent mujtahid. And again, the qualifications differ. Many Muslim scholars don't think that it's even possible to become a mujtahid at that level anymore. A lot of Muslim scholars, let's say like Asyuti or Ibn Hanbal or al-Lakhnawi in India, they thought that no, they can continue to be mujtahids even at the absolute level until the end of time, because the Prophet said that there'll be someone who comes every 100 years to renew the religion. So at least there's someone who's going to come and do that every 100 years. The question then is, what qualifications does that require? Some of the early scholars like Ibn Hanbal would give really impossibly high qualifications. Like you have to memorize several dozen thousand or even several 100,000 hadiths, which means it's almost impossible to do in general, let alone today. Other scholars, like the famous Yemeni scholar As-San'ani, he died 1768, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Amir As-San'ani. He has a whole book called Irshad al-Nuqad ila Taysir al-Ijtihad, directing critics to the ease of doing ijtihad. And what he basically argues in this book is that it's actually not that hard to become mujtahid in the ultimate sense. Sure, clearly it's not something just every guy on the street can do, but that if you have if you know the Quran very well, you know certainly all the verses of the Quran that deal with legal issues, you have a very good mastery of hadith, you have access to all the major hadith collections, you know the major hadiths dealing with law, if you have very good command of Arabic grammar, you have a very good command of legal theory, usul al-fiqh, in this situation, you in theory could be a mujtahid. So he argues that it's not as difficult as people make it out to be. I think so, but I think that's good. I mean, I don't think people should not be afraid. I think that when you're giving your opinion about what you think is pleasing to God, or what you think is the proper action or belief of a Muslim, that should be a big deal. You shouldn't just do that without a good degree of trepidation. So, and when people look for either precedents or maybe others who agree with them in the present time, what they're looking for is to bolster their opinion. I mean, they don't want to look like they're the only one coming up with an idea. They want to make sure that people understand that there's others who share this. And I think that's also a healthy behavior. Because I think the opposite, either being hasty or sort of artificially interested in standing out, is not a sign of healthy spirituality. I think it's a sign of a degree of arrogance and inappropriate ease with speaking about matters of great importance. I think that, it's interesting. Muslims have always, Muslim states especially, Muslim rulers, have always sought religious legitimization for pursuing their political ends or their military ends. In general, especially, the Muslim states after the Umayyad dynasty, they would do so not necessarily through direct quotation of hadiths or the Quran, but through reference to their scholars, usually sometimes bureaucratized scholars who worked for that state. So the idea of kind of directly citing Quran and hadith for political position, I think it's relatively new, not because somehow people have gotten reconnected to the Quran and the Sunnah, but just because Muslims who are not a state or representative of a state, they don't have some body of muftis to legitimize their opinions. So they kind of have to do so more directly with the Quran and the Sunnah. And, these extremist groups you mentioned, I mean, they tend to, by definition, be non-state actors. I mean, they don't enjoy the institutions of the state. So they're oftentimes quite opposed to what they would consider ulama sultan, or the ulama who works for the governments, because they consider those governments to be illegitimate, and they consider the ulama who provide services to those governments to be stooges of those governments. So they're not at all going to cite them. Rather, they'd prefer to present an interpretation of the religion that relies on its original scriptures for purposes of convincing others of its legitimacy. I mean, they use a lot of hadiths, but they use hadiths, for example, the idea that one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is that a slave woman will give birth to her mistress, to say that slavery will return before the Day of Judgment. Therefore, their revival of slavery is falling in line with signs that the Prophet had already predicted of the coming of the Day of Judgment. I think they're I don't necessarily think they specifically misuse hadiths or even Quranic verses and any individual ones that are key. I think they're generally just, Kharijites. They're Khawarij, in that they think that Muslims who don't agree with them, who don't see Islam as they do, are not Muslims and therefore they can be killed. And that's not necessarily because of a specific misunderstanding of any one Quranic verse or hadith. I think it's a general attitude towards how you treat scripture and how you treat disagreement, a refusal to acknowledge plurality of opinion. Well, I mean, hadiths are pieces of information. A hadith is a piece of data. And, you do your best to authenticate the truth or the reliability of that piece of data. But it's always just a piece of data. I mean, it goes into a larger equation. You have to look at, all the relevant hadiths on an issue together. You have to determine their reliability. You have to see what their relationship to one another is. You have to see how they relate to the Quran. You have to see how they relate to other principles of Islamic jurisprudence. And only then can you arrive at a conclusion regarding any question. So I don't think it's necessarily that we should think about the relationship, the Quran being higher than the Sunnah or higher than the Hadiths. I think that we have to understand that the Quran, and this is certainly in the Hanbali and the Shafi'i school the way it's understood, that the Quran and the Sunnah are on equal levels because they explain each other, they clarify each other, they add to each other, and although one is the word of God and one is the word of a man, in terms of their interpretive weights, they're equals. In fact, the Sunnah might even have more power than the Quran because it explains the Quran and adds to the Quran. If you think that the Quran is more authoritative than Hadiths, then you should be ready to cut any thief's hand off because the Quran says, male or female thief should have their hand cut off. It's only if you accept the role of Hadiths in adding to, restricting, and clarifying that command that you end up with a law that says that only if you steal something above a certain value from a secured location that you don't think is your own property and you admit to doing it and blah, 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 and blah, 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 and blah, blah, 2 pages of conditions, only then would you get your hand chopped off. Otherwise, you would just have to compensate the person for the theft or you might be punished by prison time or something. So I think that if we don't acknowledge the Hadith as being extremely important, then we end up with an understanding of the Quran which is, I think, quite warped. I think that, if you think about a state as being a political entity that attempts to organize citizens' lives according to certain values and to provide them with certain services, I'd say that an Islamic state is one that would affirm and guard people's rights to life, security, property, dignity, religion. I think that it would make sure that the poor were cared for and that no one was so desperately poor that they couldn't survive. I think it would be one that made sure that labor was fairly compensated, that markets were fair and not just free but fair. I think there would be ones where the government was selected by some means of public agreements where rulers had accountability to the population, and if they failed in the population's expectations, fair expectations that this ruler would be removed or should step down from power. So I think in terms of political life, accountability, transparency, and peaceful transition of power would be the most important things. I think democracy is sort of like fetishized. If we mean by that kind of elections, and by that I do not mean the sort of Sisi line that elections aren't that important. It's the army that gets chosen. I don't mean to say elections are not important. I just mean that I think that certain societies are better. Populations are more prepared for the responsibility of direct democracy than other societies. And so I think for me the importance is accountable governments and accountable to the people. And if a system, if a state exists that has means of doing that aren't just kind of electoral democracy choosing every important position, I think that would be acceptable. So, for example, if you say that, in a democratic state, people should have the right to change laws to whatever they want, I don't think that would be acceptable for Muslims, because you could have a law that would say that, let's say it's acceptable for Muslims to drink alcohol or something like that, and that would not be acceptable. So, I think in an Islamic state you'd have an element that there's certain rules that could not be changed even by democratic will, which is, by the way, not that different from countries like Germany, where they have clauses in their constitution that, for example, prohibit democratic process from creating a dictatorship, or from prohibit a democracy from actually removing that constitution. So even constitutions can have like some non-suicide clauses or something. So other non-Muslim states as well have conceptions of rights and political processes that are not subject to democratic approval or change. And Muslim state, I think, would probably have that as well. I mean, the Sharia can never be the only source of law, because the Sharia reserves a large place for example, local custom, urf or ada. It reserves a large place for the discretion of the ruler, or siyasa, on things like taxation, control of borders, organization of military, structure of government, basic everyday rules for road traffic control and things like that. So there's the Sharia acknowledges that there are other input sources to its application and in its application. And that's going to differ based on local custom and local political culture. So in that sense, I mean, I think even a country that is only wants to use the Sharia will also necessarily have to acknowledge the importance of things like local custom, local political culture. And if countries want to be influenced by outside political cultures, that also might be helpful. I mean, if you see, for example, that it's not the case at all, but let's say the United States' criminal justice system has come up with a really effective means of deterrence in crimes. Certain ways of dealing with crimes, not through punishment, but as some kind of rehabilitation, then it would be well within the Sharia rights of a Muslim state or a Muslim ruler to say, I don't want to whip anybody, I don't want to put anyone in prison, I want people to go and learn how to, make better, do some craft, or learn how to be a plumber or something like that. That would be within their rights, even within the Sharia, because there's a huge amount of criminal law is under what's called ta'zir, or discretionary punishment. So I think that if you see some other country that has an effective system, you could import that into an Islamic state as well. Well, I mean, in things like criminal code, that was actually done entirely Sharia legitimately, in the sense that let's say the Ottoman criminal code of the 1830s, sorry, not the 1830s, 1858, if they just, instead of having their punishments for discretionary punishments, they just imported French discretionary punishments. So that's entirely legitimate, even within the Sharia. If you do, let's say, commercial law, there's all sorts of elements of commercial law, like in Hanafi law, for example. What kind of conditions can you place on a sale or a contract? Conditions that are accepted by urf are acceptable. So if you say, well, we kind of want to shift our urf to another type of urf because we think it's more effective, in theory that would be acceptable, even in the Hanafi school of law. So I think there's a lot more room than people think for adopting and changing the details of the law. But I mean, there's certain things that you can't change. I mean, you can't, for example, change marriage to be between two men or two women. You can't change, you can't change it so that, barring some kind of wasiya or will, that someone's inheritance is going to be distributed according to inheritance law other than the Quranic and Sunnah inheritance law. So I think there's some things you can't change, but a lot you can. mean, I don't, look, the Western legal tradition is the Western legal tradition. It's creation of Western countries. It's creation of their culture and their histories, it imbued with their values. It's not a universal legal system by any means. Neither are human rights. I mean, is it really a human right that someone should be able to have, to live according to any sexual lifestyle they want? Some people think that. A lot of people don't think that. So if there's disagreement on it, how can it be a human right? I think that Muslims should pay attention to other legal systems. They should pay attention to Western discourse on human rights or women's rights or religious liberty, because sometimes these discourses can remind us of things in our own religious tradition that we might have forgotten or might have been blind to. So, I think, for example, women's rights discourse can remind Muslims that actually a lot of the way that Muslims treat, Muslim women are treated in their communities doesn't really have any firm basis in the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet, that they actually expressions of later jurists or later cultures. And that if you look back at the original role of women in the Muslim community at the time of the Prophet, that it was much more prominent, much more public than a lot of Muslims today would be comfortable with. So in that sense, the Western discourse can remind us of things that we should be aware of within our tradition. But I don't think people should just mimic another tradition for no reason unless they think that that has merit. Definitely. That's been the case for the past probably 150 years at least. It's hard to be confident in yourself and in your religion when, one, if you're like an urban, let's say urban European or urban American, one, religion in general is constantly being attacked and constantly being defamed and constantly being denigrated, constantly being shown or claimed to be inferior to science and those other systems. And two, Islam in particular is just under a constant assault, constant assault. So any bad thing a Muslim does anywhere in the world is shoved in your face in the news, and you're forced to answer to it and answer for it. And enough years of that, and it's very hard to feel that you have any faith in that religion. And I think, by the way, that's the purpose of this type of news. I think it's intended to push Muslims away from their religion until they no longer have any attachment. I don't think that's just random, and that in European countries and in the United States, this is the dominant way that Islam is portrayed in the media. It's designed to detach Muslims from their religion and turn them into these anodyne, bland, apolitical, Western peon citizens.